There are moments when the mind feels like a crowded room where everyone is speaking at once. Have you ever wished for just 1 minute of silence inside your own thoughts? Some nights, I lie awake, listening to my mind race through worries, memories, and plans, a tireless messenger that never rests. The endless internal dialogue that follows us from sunrise to sunset and haunts the spaces between dreams. Perhaps you know this feeling too. My grandmother used to say that a busy mind is like a river that's forgotten how to flow peacefully, rushing, churning, never pausing to reflect the sky above. I remember watching her hands, weathered by time yet steady as she kneaded bread, while I sat at her kitchen table, my thoughts already scattered in 1,000 directions. "Child," she would say, her voice like warm honey over cornbread, "your mind is trying to protect you from what it fears most. Stillness." I didn't understand then. How could stillness be frightening? But years later, when the world grew loud and my thoughts louder still, I began to recognize what she meant. There is a peculiar terror in allowing the mind to grow quiet, as if we might disappear if we aren't constantly thinking ourselves into existence. You've felt it too, haven't you? That moment when your thoughts finally begin to slow and something like panic rises in your chest, urging you to fill the space with more noise, more plans, more worries. We become addicted to the chaos inside our heads, wearing busyness like armor against the vulnerability of simply being. I spent decades filling every second with thoughts, as if silence were an emptiness to be feared rather than a fullness to be embraced. My mind racing from the moment I opened my eyes, planning meals, rehearsing conversations that might never happen, replaying old hurts until they felt fresh again. The world tells us this is normal, that a productive mind is always moving, always creating, always solving. We celebrate the constant hum of activity as if it were a virtue rather than a symptom of our collective fear of what might rise to the surface if we allowed ourselves to be still. But beneath the noise, something waits, something ancient and wise that cannot speak until we create space for it. I remember the first time I recognized the toll of my restless mind. I was standing in a grocery store, list in hand, when suddenly I couldn't remember why I was there or what I needed. My thoughts had been so busy planning tomorrow that they had stolen today from me. And in that moment, I realized how much of my life had slipped through my fingers while I was lost in thought. The mind that never silences steals more than our peace. It steals our presence. It robs us of the taste of fresh berries on our tongue, the feeling of our children's hands in ours, the depth of connection when someone speaks and we truly hear them. Perhaps you've walked through a beautiful garden and realized afterward that you saw nothing, your mind too occupied with past and future to notice the present blooming all around you. Or sat across from someone you love, nodding at their words while your thoughts wandered miles away. The irony is that we think our constant thinking keeps us safe, keeps us ahead, keeps us in control. But what if it's actually carrying us away from the very life we're trying to secure? My dear sister, your mind is a wonderful servant but a terrible master. And somewhere along the way, many of us have forgotten who should be giving the orders. There's something about 3 o'clock in the morning that magnifies every thought. Have you noticed? The house grows quiet, the world sleeps, and suddenly your mind decides it's time to replay every mistake you've ever made, every word you should have said differently, every path not taken. I used to believe I was alone in these midnight reckonings, until one evening at a women's gathering, when Marian, her silver hair gleaming in the candlelight, confessed that she hadn't slept through the night in 20 years. The room fell silent, and then, one by one, women began to nod, recognizing themselves in her words. "My mind," Marian said softly. "It's like it's been saving up things to worry about all day, waiting for the moment when my head hits the pillow." We all laughed then, but it was the kind of laughter that carries relief, the sudden understanding that we are not alone in our struggles. The echoes that fill our minds at midnight are often voices from the past. The critical parent who told us we weren't enough, the teacher who suggested we shouldn't aim so high, the lover who left without explanation, the child we couldn't protect from pain. These voices blend with our own until we can no longer distinguish between what others have said about us and what we've come to believe about ourselves. I spent many nights wrestling with these voices, trying to argue them into silence, trying to prove them wrong. But fighting thoughts only seems to make them stronger, doesn't it? Like struggling in quicksand, we sink deeper into the very patterns we're trying to escape. What I've come to understand through years of midnight battles is that these voices aren't asking to be defeated. They're asking to be heard, to be acknowledged, to be held with the same tenderness we would offer a frightened child. The mind that never silences is often a mind that has never felt truly listened to, even by ourselves. One night, unable to sleep as usual, I tried something different. Instead of pushing away the thoughts or getting frustrated with myself for having them, I simply sat up in bed, lit a small candle, and said aloud, "I hear you. I'm listening." And then I did something that felt strange at first. I began to write down every thought exactly as it came, without judgment, without trying to fix anything. I'm worried about money. I should have called my sister. What if I'm not good enough? I'm getting old. No one really sees me. Page after page of fears, regrets, anxieties, all the thoughts that had been circling endlessly in my mind. And as I wrote, something shifted. Not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, like ice beginning to thaw. The thoughts didn't disappear, but they began to lose some of their urgency, some of their power. Because when we shine a light on the shadows that haunt us, we often discover they aren't as terrifying as they seemed in the dark. Perhaps you've tried to silence your mind through distraction television until your eyes grow heavy, scrolling through your phone until the words blur, a glass of wine to dull the edges of your thoughts. I understand. We all seek relief from the echoes that follow us into the night. But what if, instead of trying to outrun them, we turn to face them? Not to fight, not to argue, but simply to listen with compassion. The mind that never silences is often protecting us from feelings we believe we cannot bear to feel. The grief, too deep to touch. The anger we were taught was unacceptable. The disappointment we've never allowed ourselves to acknowledge. My dear sister, your restless thoughts are not your enemies. They are messengers, carrying important information about what you need, what you fear, what you value, what you long for. And like all messengers, they will continue knocking at your door until their message is received. Tonight, as you lie awake with thoughts racing, I invite you to greet them differently, to say, "I hear you," and to listen not with frustration or resistance, but with the gentle curiosity you might offer to a friend who comes to your door in the middle of the night with something important to share. The midnight hour may always bring its echoes, but perhaps, over time, they can become less like tormentors and more like old acquaintances, familiar visitors who no longer have the power to steal your peace. Have you ever noticed how the things we don't say seem to gain weight over time? The unspoken apology, the unexpressed grief, the love declared only in the privacy of our own hearts. These silent words don't simply disappear, they linger, taking up space in our minds, growing heavier with each passing day. I remember sitting at my mother's bedside during her final days. There were so many things I wanted to tell her, questions about her life before I was born. Gratitude for sacrifices I only understood once I became a mother myself. Forgiveness for hurts neither of us had ever fully acknowledged. But the words caught in my throat, held captive by years of practiced silence. "It's all right," she whispered, her hand finding mine. "I already know." But did she? And even if she did, why had I waited until time was slipping away to consider speaking these truths aloud? The mind that never silences is often crowded with conversations we've never had with others, with ourselves, with God. These internal dialogues play on endless loops, growing more elaborate with each repetition, creating alternate realities of what might have been said, what could still be said, what perhaps should never be said at all. You know this weight, don't you? The heaviness of carrying words that need release, the mental exhaustion of rehearsing conversations that never happen. The way unexpressed emotions can color everything, making us sharp with the grocery clerk because we can't be honest with our partner, making us withdraw from friends because we can't confront a relative, making us lie awake arguing with someone who isn't even there. I spent years carrying the weight of words I couldn't speak to my father. Words about how his absence had shaped me, how his criticism had wounded me, how despite everything, I still longed for his approval. In my mind, I crafted perfect speeches, eloquent, measured, impossible to dismiss. But when we were face to face, I spoke only of the weather, his health, the mundane details that filled the space between us, but never bridged it. One day, cleaning out old papers, I found a photograph my father holding me as an infant, looking at me with such tenderness it took my breath away. And suddenly I understood that he, too, had carried unspoken words, that perhaps his silence had been as heavy for him as mine had been for me. The revelation didn't erase the pain of what remained unsaid between us, but it softened something in me, created space for a new understanding. And while I never did have that perfect conversation with him before he passed, I began writing letters I would never send, pouring out all the words that had been crowding my mind, acknowledging both the love and the hurt, speaking my full truth not to change him but to free myself. The mind fills with noise when the heart is full of silence. Perhaps there are words you've been carrying too long, words of anger that you fear might burn bridges if released, words of pain that might break the careful facade of strength you've maintained. Words of desire that might disrupt the comfortable patterns of your relationships. Words of truth that might require you to live differently once they've been spoken aloud. The weight of these unspoken words affects not just our minds but our bodies. The tension in your shoulders, the tightness in your chest, the headaches that come without warning, these are sometimes physical manifestations of emotional truths seeking expression. I'm not suggesting that every thought needs to be spoken. Some silences protect relationships that matter. Some truths are ours alone to hold. Some words, once released, cannot be taken back. But when unspoken words become a burden that keeps your mind endlessly churning, it may be time to consider, who needs to hear these words? Is it someone else, or is it perhaps you yourself? Sometimes the conversation that needs to happen most urgently is the one with our own hearts, acknowledging what we truly feel, what we truly need, what we truly want. Speaking these truths to ourselves can be the first step toward either finding the courage to express them to others or making peace with keeping them private. My dear sister, the mind that never silences is often carrying words too important to remain unspoken. Listen closely to your restless thoughts. What are they trying to tell you? What truth is asking to be acknowledged? What story needs to be told if only to yourself? The release may not come all at once, but each truth you acknowledge, each feeling you name, each need you honor creates more space within you, space where, perhaps, silence might finally feel like peace rather than suppression. Have you ever tried to count the thoughts that pass through your mind in a single minute? They come like leaves in autumn, swirling, overlapping, impossible to capture or contain. To-do lists intertwine with memories, worries blend with plans, random observations mix with deep questions about purpose and meaning. This garden of scattered thoughts, this beautiful, chaotic, exhausting internal landscape is where many of us spend our days. I remember sitting in a doctor's waiting room, watching an elderly woman with gnarled hands slowly turning the pages of a magazine. Her face held such serenity, such presence. When our eyes met, she smiled a smile that seemed to come from a different world than the one where my thoughts were racing about deadlines and dinner plans and whether I'd remembered to lock the back door. "How do you do it?" I asked, surprising myself with my directness. "Do what, dear?" she replied, closing her magazine. "Stay so." "Here," I said. "My mind is everywhere but in this room." She laughed then, a sound like wind chimes. "Oh, honey," she said, "I spent 60 years with a mind like a butterfly, never landing anywhere for more than a moment. It wasn't until I lost so much that I realized the only place worth being is right where your feet are." Her words stayed with me, a gentle challenge to my scattered way of living. I began to notice how rarely I was fully present in my own life, how I could be washing dishes while mentally drafting emails, how I could be listening to a friend while internally composing my grocery list, how I could be walking through a beautiful park while lost in replaying an argument from days ago. The scattered mind isn't something that happens to us, it's something we've been trained to cultivate. In a world that values productivity above presence, that rewards multitasking above deep focus, that bombards us with information and demands immediate responses, our scattered thoughts aren't a failure of attention, they're exactly what's expected of us. But at what cost? I was 45 before I realized I couldn't remember the taste of most meals I'd eaten, couldn't recall the content of most conversations I'd had, couldn't describe the feeling of most experiences I'd lived through because I hadn't really been there for them. I'd been physically present but mentally elsewhere, always planning the next moment instead of living the current one. Perhaps you know this feeling too, the sense that life is slipping through your fingers not because you aren't doing enough, but because you aren't fully experiencing what you're already doing. The scattered mind creates a scattered life, fragments of experiences, fragments of connections, fragments of joy that never quite coalesce into the deep satisfaction we hunger for. I began experimenting with small moments of presence, washing a single dish with complete attention, feeling the water's warmth, noticing the soap's scent, watching light play on bubbles, listening to my grandson with my whole being, not just my ears, but my eyes, my heart, my full attention, walking from my front door to the mailbox as if it were the only journey that mattered, feeling each step, noticing the sky's particular blue, hearing birds I'd been too distracted to perceive before. These tiny moments didn't quiet my mind completely, but they created small clearings in the constant mental chatter spaces where I could breathe, where I could remember what it feels like to be fully alive, fully present in my own existence. The garden of scattered thoughts doesn't need to be demolished, it simply needs tending. Some thoughts are like weeds, repetitive worries that drain our energy without bearing fruit. Some are like delicate flowers, creative insights that need space and nurturing to fully bloom. Some are like sturdy trees, deep values and loves that can provide shelter and orientation when we feel lost. Learning to distinguish between these types of thoughts, to weed gently, to nurture carefully, to appreciate the beauty of the whole ecosystem of our minds is a lifelong practice. My dear sister, your scattered thoughts aren't evidence of failure or weakness. They're a natural response to a world that pulls your attention in 1,000 directions at once. But you don't have to live at the mercy of every thought that passes through your mind. You can create small sanctuaries of presence in your day, moments where you fully inhabit your own life, where you taste your food, feel the sun on your skin, hear the voice of someone you love, without the filter of distraction. The mind that never silences doesn't need to become perfectly quiet. It simply needs moments of rest, islands of presence in the stream of constant thinking, where you can remember who you are beneath the noise of who you think you should be. There are thoughts that visit us not from the day's concerns or tomorrow's anxieties, but from somewhere much deeper, from the wells of ancestral memory, from the shadows of collective wounds, from stories written in our bones long before we drew our first breath. I call these the ancient shadows, patterns of thinking so deeply ingrained that they feel less like thoughts and more like truths. the belief that you must always be strong, the fear that rest equals laziness, the conviction that your worth must be earned, the suspicion that happiness, if it comes, cannot possibly last. These are not merely personal neuroses. They are inheritances passed down through generations of women who survived by thinking in these ways, who protected themselves and their loved ones by staying vigilant, by expecting little, by working beyond exhaustion, by putting everyone else first. I remember standing in my kitchen at 53, suddenly overwhelmed by a familiar feeling, the sense that despite my accomplishments, despite the love surrounding me, despite all evidence to the contrary, I was not enough and would never be enough. The feeling came with such force that I had to grip the counter to steady myself. In that moment, I had a vision of sorts, not mystical, but clarifying. I saw myself as a link in a long chain of women. My mother, who never believed her paintings were good enough to show. My grandmother, who apologized for her existence in 1,000 small ways each day. Great-grandmothers I'd never met who crossed oceans and endured hardships I could barely imagine. And I understood, this feeling of not enough wasn't mine alone. It had traveled through bloodlines and time, a strategy for survival in worlds where a woman's value was determined by others, where safety depended on meeting impossible standards, where visibility could be dangerous. The ancient shadows in our minds are not enemies, they are ancestors, protectors, parts of ourselves that developed for good reasons in difficult times. They don't need to be banished. They need to be acknowledged, honored, and gently updated about the reality of our current lives. Perhaps you've felt these ancient patterns in your own mind. The voice that says you're selfish if you prioritize your needs. The fear that whispers you'll be abandoned if you show your true self. The belief that your body is a disappointment rather than a miracle. The conviction that you must earn love through service and sacrifice. When these thoughts arise, creating discord in your mind that no amount of positive thinking seems to quiet, consider that you may be experiencing not just personal insecurity, but the echo of generational wisdom that has outlived its usefulness. The mind that never silences sometimes speaks in voices that are not entirely our own. I began having conversations with these ancient shadows, not arguing with them or trying to silence them, but listening with respect and curiosity. When the thought arose that taking time for myself was selfish, I would ask, who taught you that? Who needed to believe that to survive? Sometimes the answer would come as a memory, my mother, exhausted but still mending clothes late into the night. Sometimes as a family story, Great Aunt Eliza, who never married because she was needed at home to care for younger siblings. Sometimes as a feeling the subtle pride in martyrdom that permeated my childhood home. And with this understanding came not an immediate silencing of the thought, but a gentle loosening of its grip, a creation of space between the ancient shadow and my present reality. A chance to choose whether this inherited belief still served me or whether it was time to thank it for its protection and set it aside. This dance with ancient shadows, honoring their origin while reclaiming our right to think differently, is delicate work. It requires patience, compassion for ourselves and our lineage, and the courage to imagine new possibilities. Some days the shadows feel heavier than others. Some patterns run so deep that they resist transformation. The voice that says never rest may grow quieter but resurface in times of stress. The fear of taking up too much space may ease but return in unfamiliar settings. This is not failure. It is the nature of healing work that spans generations. My dear sister, when your mind fills with thoughts that feel older and deeper than your own experience, thoughts that constrict rather than expand your life, consider that you may be carrying wisdom that once protected your lineage but now limits your joy. You can honor these ancient shadows without being ruled by them. You can thank your grandmothers for the mental habits that helped them survive while choosing patterns that help you thrive. You can recognize the strength in your inheritance while claiming the freedom to think in new ways. The mind that never silences often carries the unfinished business of those who came before us. By listening to these ancient patterns with compassion, by understanding their origins, by consciously choosing which to keep and which to transform, we do healing work not just for ourselves, but for our entire lineage, past and future. There are times when the mind's noise becomes not just distracting but overwhelming, when thoughts race so quickly they steal your breath, when worry spirals into panic, when the internal dialogue grows so loud it drowns out everything else. These mental storms can leave us feeling helpless, at the mercy of our own thinking. I was 42 when I experienced my first panic attack. Standing in a crowded department store, suddenly unable to breathe, certain I was dying, my mind racing with terrifying possibilities. I didn't understand then that my body was responding to thoughts. My conscious mind hadn't even registered thoughts of inadequacy triggered by a casual comment hours earlier. Thoughts of scarcity awakened by an unexpected bill, thoughts of isolation deepened by weeks of overwork and underrest. The connection between our breath and our thoughts is ancient and profound. When the mind races, the breath grows shallow. When the breath grows shallow, the body signals danger. When the body signals danger, the mind races faster, still a cycle that can feel impossible to break. I learned this lesson not from books, but from necessity, from finding myself again and again in the grip of a mind that had spun beyond my control, from searching for any anchor in the storm. It was Rosa, a woman in my community who had survived unimaginable hardship during civil war in her home country, who first taught me that the breath could be such an anchor. I had asked her, with the directness that sometimes comes from desperation, how she managed to remain so centered, so present, despite all she had endured. When everything was taken, she told me, her eyes holding steady on mine, breath remained. When I had no control over anything else, I could still choose how to breathe. So I breathed like my grandmother taught me, slowly, deeply, as if drinking life itself through my nose and sending it to every cell in my body. She placed her hand on her belly, demonstrating the rise and fall. This breath, she said, has carried me through nightmares you cannot imagine. It will carry you through yours as well. I was skeptical but willing to try anything, and so began my relationship with conscious breathing, not as a spiritual practice or a self-improvement technique, but as a lifeline when my mind threatened to pull me under. What I discovered, slowly and imperfectly, was that while I couldn't stop my thoughts, I could change my relationship to them by changing how I breathe. A deep breath created just enough space to remember that I was not my thoughts. Another deep breath reminded me that thoughts come and go, like weather, sometimes calm, sometimes stormy, but always changing. A third deep breath brought me back to my body, to the present moment, to the reality that despite my racing mind, I was still here, still whole, still capable of choosing my next action. Perhaps you've experienced your own mental storms, moments when anxiety tightens your chest, when regret keeps you awake at night, when worst-case scenarios play on repeat despite your best efforts to change the channel. Perhaps you too have felt the helplessness of being caught in thoughts that seem to have a life and power of their own. The breath will not silence these thoughts. That isn't its purpose. But it can create a refuge within the storm, a place to stand while the winds of anxiety or regret or fear blow around you. It can remind your body that you are safe even when your mind insists otherwise. It can bring you back to the present moment when your thoughts have carried you far into imagined futures or painful pasts. I began to notice the relationship between certain thoughts and my physical response to them. The tight jaw that accompanied self-criticism, the shallow breathing that came with worry about my children, the clenched stomach that arrived with financial concerns. These physical responses weren't separate from my thoughts, they were part of the same experience, the mind and body speaking the same language of distress. and I discovered something both simple and revolutionary. By changing my physical response, I could sometimes change the thoughts themselves. By softening my jaw, my self-criticism would often ease. By deepening my breath, my worry about loved ones became more manageable. By relaxing my stomach, my financial anxiety might not disappear, but it would become less overwhelming. The mind that never silences doesn't need force or discipline to find moments of peace. It needs the gentle invitation of the breath drawing us back to our bodies, back to the present, back to the simple truth that this moment, right now, is all we ever truly have. My dear sister, when your mind becomes a storm that threatens to sweep you away, remember that your breath remains an anchor available in any moment. Not to silence your thoughts or deny your feelings, but to create enough space within them that you can remember who you are beyond the noise. Breathe as if drinking life itself through your nose and sending it to every cell in your body. Let your exhale carry tension from your shoulders, your jaw, your heart. Feel your feet on the floor, the air on your skin, the rise and fall of your chest. This practice won't banish the storms, but over time, it can help you learn to dance in the rain, to move with your difficult thoughts rather than being moved by them, to find moments of peace even when your mind continues its conversation, to remember that you are more than the weather passing through you. There comes a point in our struggle with the overactive mind when we realize a profound truth. The harder we fight against our thoughts, the stronger they become. The more desperately we chase silence, the more elusive it grows. The tighter we grip our desire for mental peace, the more it slips through our fingers like water. This was perhaps the most difficult lesson for me to learn, this paradox of surrender, because I was raised to believe that everything worth having required effort, discipline, control. That success in any area, including peace of mind, was a matter of trying harder, doing more, never giving up. I spent years in this battle with my own thoughts, setting timers for meditation, forcing myself to concentrate, berating myself when my mind wandered, treating every intrusive thought as evidence of failure. My quest for mental quiet had become another source of noise, another reason for self-judgment, another way to prove my inadequacy. The turning point came unexpectedly, during a week when everything seemed to be falling apart. My daughter was going through a difficult divorce. My own health was uncertain, with tests scheduled and specialists consulted. The roof was leaking, the car needed repairs, and my savings were dwindling. My mind, predictably, was in overdrive, spinning scenarios, rehashing conversations, calculating costs, imagining worst outcomes. I had neither the energy nor the will to continue my disciplined attempts at quieting it. And so, one rainy afternoon, I simply stopped trying. I sat in my favorite chair, wrapped in an old quilt my mother had made, and allowed my mind to be exactly as it was, chaotic, frightened, racing from thought to thought like a squirrel gathering nuts before winter. I surrendered not because I had found wisdom, but because I had run out of fight. And in that surrender, something unexpected happened. Not silence my thoughts continued their dance, but a shift in my relationship to them. I became like the sky, observing weather patterns still present, but no longer identified with the storm. My thoughts lost none of their intensity, but they lost something of their power over me. This is what I have come to call the soft space of surrender, not giving up on peace, but giving up the battle that prevents peace from finding us. Perhaps you've experienced something similar, moments when, exhausted by your attempts to control your mind, you've temporarily abandoned the effort, only to find a different kind of relief than the one you were seeking. Not the pristine silence you imagined, but a messy, imperfect peace that comes from allowing things to be as they are. The mind that never silences cannot be conquered, but it can be befriended. It cannot be controlled, but it can be embraced with compassion rather than resistance. I began to practice this surrender in small ways. When anxious thoughts about my daughter arose, instead of trying to replace them with positive thinking, I would silently acknowledge, "Here's worry. It makes sense that I'm concerned." When financial fears appeared, rather than pushing them away with affirmations, I would simply note, "Here's fear about money. Many people feel this. I'm not alone in this experience." This approach didn't empty my mind of difficult thoughts, but it drained them of much of their distressing power. A worry acknowledged tends to soften. A fear named becomes just another experience rather than an all-consuming identity. Gradually, I began to understand that the peace I had been seeking wasn't the absence of thought, but the presence of acceptance. Not a perfectly silent mind, but a mind that could hold its own activity with gentleness rather than judgment. The soft space of surrender isn't resignation or defeat. It's not giving up on growth or healing. It's simply recognizing that true change often begins when we stop fighting against what is, when we create enough space around our experience to respond with wisdom rather than reaction. In time, I found that this approach altered not just my relationship to my thoughts, but the nature of the thoughts themselves. Not because I was controlling them, but because I was no longer feeding them with resistance. Without the fuel of my opposition, many of my most persistent worries gradually lost their intensity, not disappearing entirely, but settling into a more manageable hum rather than a deafening roar. My dear sister, when your mind feels most chaotic, when your thoughts seem most relentless, when your internal dialogue is at its loudest, consider that the path to peace might not be through more effort, but through a deeper surrender, not giving your power away to your thoughts, but recognizing that your true power has never depended on controlling them. Try sitting with your restless mind as you might sit with a frightened child, not scolding it for its fear, not demanding that it calm down, but simply being present with compassion, creating a safe space for whatever arises. You might be surprised by how this simple shift in approach can transform your experience, even when the content of your thoughts remains unchanged. The mind that never silences doesn't need to be fixed. It needs to be met with understanding, to be seen, heard, and embraced exactly as it is, in all its messy, human imperfection. Beneath the noise of our thoughts, behind the endless internal dialogue, there exists another voice, quieter, deeper, wiser than our everyday thinking. Some call it intuition. Others name it the soul's knowing. In my grandmother's tradition, it was simply called the heart that sees in the dark. Whatever name we give it, this voice speaks a different language than our busy minds. It doesn't argue or analyze. It doesn't weigh pros and cons or rehearse worst-case scenarios. It doesn't speak in shoulds or if-onlys. It whispers simple truths that resonate in the body as much as in the mind, truths that feel both surprising and somehow familiar, as if we're remembering rather than learning. For years, I couldn't hear this voice at all. The clamor of my analytical mind, the constant chatter of my insecurities and anxieties, the noise of external opinions I had internalized, all of it drowned out this deeper knowing. I made decisions based entirely on logic, on others' expectations, on cultural definitions of success, on fear of failure or rejection or disapproval. Some of those decisions led me where I thought I wanted to go. Many led to achievements I could proudly list on a resume, but none led to the sense of alignment and peace I secretly hungered for, the feeling that my outer life reflected my inner truth. I was 49 when circumstances forced me to listen differently. A career opportunity that looked perfect on paper, more money, more prestige, more security. My mind produced endless lists of reasons to accept it. My friends and family all agreed it was the obvious choice. But something felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate, a heaviness in my chest when I imagined saying yes. a subtle constriction in my throat when I tried to express enthusiasm, a mysterious fatigue that descended whenever I thought about the details of the new position. These bodily sensations weren't dramatic enough to qualify as warning signs in my logical framework, but they were persistent, impossible to argue away with all my excellent reasons for taking the job. Out of options and exhausted by my mental circles, I finally asked a different kind of question, not, "What should I do?" but, "What does my deeper self know about this?" Not expecting an answer, I closed my eyes and placed a hand on my heart, waiting in the darkness behind my eyelids. The response, when it came, wasn't in words. It was a simple knowing, as clear as sunlight. This path is not for you. Not wrong, but not yours. I had no logical reason to trust this knowing. It contradicted everything my thinking mind had concluded. Following it meant disappointing others, facing financial uncertainty, admitting I didn't want what I was supposed to want. But for reasons I still can't fully explain, I declined the position, the first major decision of my adult life, not made primarily through analysis and external validation. What followed wasn't immediate validation. No magical alternative appeared the next day. But something shifted internally, a sense of congruence between my choices and my deeper knowing, a feeling of walking in my own footsteps rather than following a path laid out by others' expectations. Over time, I began to recognize the subtle ways this deeper voice communicates, through dreams that linger upon waking, through unexpected tears when someone speaks a truth I've been avoiding, through a sudden clarity that arrives not after hours of deliberation but in moments of quiet receptivity, through persistent bodily sensations that defy my logical conclusions. The mind that never silences often drowns out the whispers of the healing heart. Not because it means to, but because it's doing what it was trained to do: analyze, plan, protect, conform to social expectations. These are necessary functions, but they are not the whole of our wisdom. Learning to hear the deeper voice requires creating spaces of receptivity, moments when we set aside the urgent concerns of our thinking mind and listen for the subtle communications of our deeper knowing. This isn't about silencing thought entirely, but about temporarily turning down its volume so we can hear what else might be speaking. For me, these spaces of receptivity come in different forms. Sometimes in the shower, where the white noise of water creates a cocoon around my awareness. Sometimes while walking in nature, where the rhythms of my body quiet the rhythms of my thoughts. Sometimes upon waking, in the liminal space between sleep and full alertness, when the analytical mind hasn't yet assumed its daytime dominance. In these moments, I've learned to ask simple questions and then listen without demanding immediate or logical answers. What is trying to emerge in my life right now? What am I not seeing about this situation? What does my deeper self know that my thinking self is missing? My dear sister, beneath the noise of your restless mind lies a wisdom that has been with you all along, a knowing that doesn't need to think its way to truth because it recognizes truth directly, the way your skin recognizes warmth without needing to analyze it. This wisdom speaks most clearly when you create space to listen, when you temporarily step back from the urgent problems your mind is trying to solve and open to the possibility that some answers arrive not through effort but through receptivity. The whispers of the healing heart may not provide the detailed roadmaps your thinking mind prefers. They rarely come with 5-year plans or bulleted lists of action steps. But they offer something perhaps more valuable, a felt sense of which direction holds life and which leads to diminishment, which choices create congruence between inner and outer worlds, and which fracture that delicate alignment. The mind that never silences has much to contribute, but it doesn't need to be the only voice you hear. Have you ever noticed how, even in the densest forest, light finds its way through? How sunlight slips between branches, creating patterns on the forest floor. How, no matter how thick the canopy, small openings allow brightness to penetrate the darkness below. The mind that never silences is much like that. Forest dense with thoughts, thick with concerns, heavy with responsibilities. But even in the most crowded mind, there are gaps, tiny spaces between one thought and the next, small openings where light can enter. These spaces exist naturally. They're not something we need to create through force of will or years of disciplined practice. They're already there, fleeting moments when one thought has ended and the next hasn't yet begun. Most of us have simply never learned to notice them. I discovered these spaces accidentally during a period of intense grief after losing my closest friend. My mind was a torrent of memories, regrets, unanswerable questions. Sleep eluded me. Concentration was impossible. The internal noise was constant and exhausting. One afternoon, sitting on my porch watching hummingbirds at the feeder, something shifted. For just a moment, perhaps no longer than a heartbeat, my thoughts paused as my attention was completely captured by the iridescent green of a hummingbird's throat catching the sunlight. In that tiny gap between thoughts, I experienced a moment of pure presence, no past, no future, just the vivid reality of wings and light. The moment passed quickly, swallowed by the next wave of grief. But something in me had registered its significance. For that single instant, without effort or intention, my mind had fallen silent, not through discipline or technique, but through simple absorption in beauty. In the difficult months that followed, I began to notice other such moments, small gaps in the mental narrative that had seemed so unrelenting. The space between waking and rising, when consciousness has returned, but thought hasn't yet organized itself into plans and worries. The moment of transition between tasks, when one focus has ended and another hasn't yet begun. The brief suspension of mental activity that sometimes occurs when we're startled by unexpected beauty or moved by sudden compassion. These gaps weren't long or dramatic. They didn't solve my problems or erase my pain. But they offered something precious, brief respites from the exhausting mental activity that had characterized my days, tiny windows through which I could glimpse something beyond my circling thoughts. Over time, I began to cultivate an awareness of these natural pauses, not trying to create them, but learning to notice when they occurred naturally. I discovered that certain activities seemed to invite them more frequently, simple physical tasks that required just enough attention to occupy the surface mind, but not so much that they created new tension. Washing dishes by hand, folding laundry still warm from the dryer, deadheading flowers in the garden. During these activities, gaps would appear in my thinking, small spaces between thoughts where something else could be experienced. The sensation of sunlight on skin, the sound of children playing down the street, the subtle weight of my own body existing in space, reality itself, unfiltered through ideas about reality. What I was discovering, though I didn't have words for it then, was that the mind's activity naturally ebbs and flows. Thoughts arise and pass away on their own, like clouds forming and dissolving in the sky. And in the spaces between thoughts, the light between the branches, we can experience a different kind of consciousness. Not unconsciousness or sleep, but a clear, open awareness that isn't dependent on mental activity. This discovery changed my relationship with my busy mind. Rather than seeing its constant activity as a problem to solve, a defect to be fixed through discipline or technique, I began to recognize that silence already existed within and around that activity. I didn't need to create silence. I needed only to notice where it already was. The mind that never silences does, in fact, silence itself, momentarily, thousands of times each day. These natural gaps in thinking aren't failures of concentration or momentary lapses. They're windows into a more fundamental dimension of our consciousness, one that exists beneath and beyond the thinking mind. My dear sister, your restless thoughts are like clouds in the sky, constantly changing, sometimes blocking the light, sometimes casting shadows. But the sky itself, the open awareness that witnesses those thoughts without being defined by them, is always present, always available, in the small gaps between one thought and the next. You don't need to force these gaps to widen. You don't need to battle your thoughts into submission. You need only to notice, with gentle curiosity, the moments when thinking naturally pauses the split second after you sip a perfect cup of coffee, the brief space after a deep sigh, the momentary clearing when you step outside and feel the air against your face. In these tiny gaps, something is already present, a quality of awareness that doesn't depend on thought, a sense of being that doesn't need to be created or achieved. This presence exists not in opposition to your busy mind, but alongside it, and beneath it the ground of experience upon which the drama of thinking plays out. The light between the branches isn't something you need to earn through years of practice. It's your birthright, your natural state, the consciousness that precedes and survives all mental activity. It's already here, already available, in the spaces between your thoughts. There is a story from the East about a young woman who spent years searching for a precious jewel, traveling to distant lands, studying with renowned teachers, undertaking arduous practices. After decades of seeking, she returned to her childhood home, exhausted and disappointed. As she unpacked her few belongings, something gleamed in the folds of a garment she had carried with her all along. It was the jewel she had been seeking, hidden in the hem of her own dress from the very beginning. The journey toward peace with our restless minds often follows a similar path. We search everywhere for the silence we crave in techniques and teachings, in retreats and relationships, in achievements and escapes. We struggle and strive, discipline and deny, thinking that if only we try hard enough, learn enough, practice enough, we might finally arrive at the mental quiet we imagine others have achieved. But what if the peace we seek isn't waiting at the end of a long journey? What if it's already here, woven into the fabric of our ordinary lives, hidden in plain sight within our everyday experience? I spent most of my life believing that a quiet mind was something I needed to create through effort, something that would arrive someday if I just found the right method, the right teacher, the right circumstances. I imagined it as a permanent state I could achieve and maintain if I just tried hard enough. What I've come to understand through years of both struggle and surrender is that the peace I sought was never absent. It was present all along in moments I overlooked because they didn't match my ideas about what peace should look like. It was there in the simple pleasure of stirring soup on the stove, my mind temporarily absorbed in the swirl of broth and vegetables. It was there in the quiet satisfaction of helping a neighbor carry groceries, my self-concern momentarily suspended in the act of service. It was there in the deep sleep that came after a day of honest work, my thinking mind at rest while some deeper wisdom continued its mysterious healing. These moments weren't dramatic spiritual experiences. They didn't announce themselves as significant. They didn't match my notion of what inner peace should feel like. But in each of them, my usual mental noise had temporarily subsided, not because I had conquered my thoughts, but because I had been fully engaged in living. The gentle return home is not about arriving at some perfect state of mental silence. It's about recognizing that we have never truly been separated from peace, that it has been with us all along, in the ordinary moments when we forget ourselves in beauty, in connection, in meaningful work, in simple presence. This recognition doesn't require dramatic change. It doesn't demand that we abandon our responsibilities or retreat from the world. It asks only that we notice differently, that we pay attention not just to the noise of our minds, but to the spaces where that noise naturally quiets, the moments when we spontaneously rest in being rather than doing. For me, this gentle return began with simple acknowledgement of what was already working in my relationship with my mind. The morning cup of coffee on the porch, when thinking naturally settled into the background of sensory experience. The focused attention of writing, when self-consciousness temporarily dissolved into creative flow. The wordless comfort of sitting with a friend in shared silence. These weren't manufactured states. They weren't achievements of discipline. They were natural occurrences in an ordinary life moments when the conditions for peace had spontaneously assembled themselves, when the mind had found its own way home without being forced or coerced. As I began to notice and appreciate these moments, something shifted. The gaps between thoughts, the spaces of natural quiet, seemed to occur more frequently, not because I was controlling my mind more effectively, but because I was recognizing peace where it already existed rather than searching for it somewhere else. My dear sister, the mind that never silences doesn't need to be fundamentally transformed. It needs to be seen with fresh eyes, recognized not as an obstacle to peace, but as the very vessel in which peace already appears, however briefly or incompletely. The chattering thoughts, the spinning worries, the endless planning, and remembering these aren't failures of consciousness. They're simply one aspect of your magnificent mind doing what minds do. And, alongside this mental activity, within it and between it, peace is already present in the small gaps between thoughts, in the moments of natural absorption, in the quiet that descends when you're fully engaged in something that matters. The gentle return home isn't a destination you reach once and for all. It's a continuous returning, a moment-by-moment recognition of the quiet that already exists within and around the noise. Not a perfect silence, for perfection belongs to the realm of ideas, not to lived experience, but a living peace that includes everything, the thoughts and the spaces between them, the noise and the quiet, the searching and the finding. You have never been separate from this peace. It has been with you all along, like the jewel hidden in the hem of your dress. Not something to achieve or create, but something to recognize and remember your natural state, your birthright, your true home. The mind that never silences doesn't need to be silenced. It needs only to be embraced in its fullness, including both its endless activity and the spaces of quiet that naturally occur within that activity. For when we can welcome all of it, the noise and the peace, the restlessness and the rest, we discover that the home we've been seeking has been here all along, waiting patiently for our return. As our journey through these reflections comes to a close, I invite you to sit for a moment with whatever has stirred within you. There is no perfect peace, no final destination where the mind falls permanently silent. There is only this moment with its particular mixture of thought and awareness, noise and quiet, searching and finding. Whatever the state of your mind right now, whether it feels relatively calm or intensely active, know that you are not doing anything wrong. Your thoughts, in all their variety and intensity, are not obstacles to overcome, but expressions of your magnificent human consciousness. And within and around those thoughts, peace is already present, not as a distant goal, but as the ground of your being, available in any moment you choose to notice it. The mind that never silences doesn't need to be fixed or changed. It needs only to be met with compassion, to be seen with clarity, to be embraced as one precious aspect of the mystery that you are. Rest in this knowledge, not as a concept to understand, but as a truth to experience right here, right now, in the midst of your beautiful, imperfect, entirely sufficient life. You haven't lost your way. You're already home.